The wind howling through the dense pine trees of the Ardennes forest in early December 1944 carried a deceptive silence. To the American GIs, huddled in their foxholes, stamping their freezing feet in the snow, the war felt like it was winding down. Germany was bleeding out from two fronts, its cities reduced to rubble by relentless bombing campaigns, and its armies supposedly shattered after the chaotic retreat across France. The men of the U.S. First Army believed they were sitting in a quiet sector, a ghost front, where nothing ever happened, waiting out the bitter winter until the final push into the heart of the Third Reich. But just miles away, hidden beneath the thick, freezing fog and the dense canopy of the evergreen forests, the largest, most desperate concentration of German armor and infantry since the invasion of the Soviet Union was silently assembling in the dark. Over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks were waiting for the order to unleash hell on Earth. This was not the end of the war, but the beginning of the bloodiest single battle the United States Army would ever fight in its entire history. Before we dive deep into the tactical nightmare and the strategic brilliance and blunders of the Battle of the Bulge, I want to welcome you to the channel. If you appreciate uncompromising, highly detailed military analysis that strips away the myths and looks at the cold, hard facts of warfare, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We analyze the machinery, the logistics, the men, and the terrain that shape the battlefields of history, bringing you the kind of in-depth breakdowns you will not find anywhere else. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts on the Allied intelligence failures leading up to this offensive, or share any family history if your grandfather served in the Ardennes. Your engagement keeps this channel moving forward, allowing us to keep producing these massive deep dive historical campaigns. Now let us look at the strategic board as it stood in the late fall of 1944. To understand why Adolf Hitler decided to roll his final pair of dice in the freezing snow of the Ardennes, we have to look at the catastrophic logistical reality facing the Allied forces. By November 1944, the staggering momentum of the Allied breakout from Normandy had ground to a painful, sputtering halt. The tyranny of distance had finally caught up with General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Allied armies had advanced so fast across France that they had completely outrun their own supply lines. Everything an American infantryman or a Sherman tank needed to fight, from .30 caliber ammunition to rations to high-octane aviation fuel, was still coming in through the port of Cherbourg, nearly 500 miles away from the front lines. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive fleet of nearly 6,000 cargo trucks driven mostly by African-American quartermaster troops, was performing logistical miracles every single day. But the math was brutally unforgiving. A 2.5-ton truck driving 500 miles from the beaches of Normandy to the borders of Germany consumed almost as much fuel as it was carrying in its cargo bed. The Allies had captured the massive deep-water port of Antwerp in Belgium intact, but they had failed to clear the German defenders from the Scheldt estuary leading up to it until late November. Until those sea lanes were cleared of mines and coastal guns, Antwerp was utterly useless. This logistical strangulation forced the Allied advance to stall right against the concrete teeth of the Siegfried Line, the heavily fortified German border defenses. American divisions were exhausted, their supply depots were running on fumes, and their replacement depots were struggling to keep up with the steady drain of casualties from brutal, grinding engagements like the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. The Allied High Command, including General Omar Bradley and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, believed the German army was finished as an offensive threat. Allied intelligence, heavily reliant on intercepted Enigma radio transmissions known as ULTRA, saw only a defeated enemy incapable of mounting anything more than a Nussbaum local defense. But this overconfidence was a fatal miscalculation that ignored a fundamental truth about the German military mindset. How does a nation on the brink of total collapse, facing overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority on two fronts, convince itself that a massive offensive is the only logical course of action? The answer lies deep within the DNA of the German General Staff and the Prussian military tradition. For over a century, dating back to Frederick the Great and heavily influenced by the crushing victory at Cannae in antiquity, German military doctrine was obsessed with the concept of the Vernichtungsschlacht, the battle of annihilation. German strategists did not believe in wars of attrition. because Germany simply lacked the natural resources and manpower to win them. Their entire doctrine was built on the idea of a massive, decisive strike that would encircle and destroy the enemy army in one swift, violent blow, forcing a political settlement. Hitler, staring at the total collapse of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front under the crushing weight of the Soviet Operation Bagration, knew he could not defeat the Red Army. His only hope, a desperate, delusional gamble, was to strike a decisive blow in the West. History provides striking parallels to this kind of desperate wintered gamble. Think back to the American Revolution, when George Washington crossed the icy Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776 to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. Washington's army was freezing, starving, and on the verge of total disintegration, while the British believed the colonial rebellion was effectively crushed for the winter. Washington knew that a conventional defense would lead to a slow death by attrition, so he gambled everything on a surprise offensive in miserable weather to shatter enemy complacency and secure a massive psychological victory. Similarly, we can look at the Tet Offensive of 1968 in Vietnam. The American military establishment was confident that the enemy was being ground down and that the light was at the end of the tunnel. But the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack across a broad front during a holiday period, not to win a conventional military victory, but to inflict maximum psychological shock and break the political will of their enemy. Hitler's plan in 1944 was built on the exact same premise. He believed that the alliance between the capitalist Americans and British was fragile and that a sudden, catastrophic defeat would fracture their coalition, forcing them to the negotiating table and allowing Germany to turn all its remaining forces against the Soviet Union. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was a masterclass in aggressive operational planning, even if it was strategically detached from reality. The objective was breathtakingly ambitious. 3 German armies would smash through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and drive all the way to the coast to recapture the port of Antwerp. This would effectively trap 4 Allied armies, the entire British 21st Army Group and the US 9th Army, in a massive pocket in northern Belgium and the Netherlands. To achieve this, Hitler selected the exact same terrain that had delivered his greatest triumph in 1940. The Ardennes is a rugged, heavily forested plateau spanning eastern Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern France. It is a topographical nightmare for mechanized warfare. The terrain is characterized by steep, heavily wooded ridges, deep ravines, and a sparse network of narrow, winding, unpaved roads that turn to thick mud or solid ice depending on the temperature. In 1940, the French High Command believed the Ardennes was impassable to tanks, allowing German panzer divisions to slice right through it and collapse the French army in weeks. In 1944, the American High Command made the exact same arrogant assumption. Because the Americans viewed the Ardennes as a quiet, impassable sector, they used it as a nursery and a retirement home. Major General Troy Middleton's V. Estes Corps was responsible for holding an incredibly stretched front line of roughly 80 miles. To defend this massive sector, Middleton had only 4 divisions, and they were in no condition to stop a major armored thrust. On the northern flank, the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions were completely green. The 106th, the Golden Lions, has literally just arrived from the United States. Many of its men had never heard a shot fired in anger, and they were still trying to figure out how to keep their rifles from freezing in the damp cold. On the southern flank, the situation was arguably worse. The 4th and 28th Infantry Divisions were veteran units, but they had just been pulled out of the meat grinder of the Hürtgen Forest. The 28th, known as the Keystone Division, had suffered catastrophic casualties, losing over 6,000 men in a matter of weeks. They were sent to the Ardennes to rest, refit, and integrate thousands of brand new, inexperienced replacements. These men were exhausted, traumatized, and severely under-equipped for winter warfare, lacking proper winter boots, white camouflage, and cold weather gear. Let us break down the exact correlation of forces and the industrial realities that dictated the weapons they carried into this frozen hell. On the American side, the backbone of the infantry was the M1 Garand. This gas-operated 8-round semi-automatic rifle gave the American infantryman a distinct advantage in rate of fire over his German counterpart, who was mostly still carrying the bolt-action Karabiner 98K. The American squad was built around the base of fire provided by the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, a reliable but heavy weapon that fired the powerful 30 caliber round. But the real American advantage lay not in small arms, but in artillery. The U.S. Army had perfected the art of flexible, massed artillery fire. Through a centralized fire direction center, American commanders could call down a time on target, or TOT, barrage. This meant coordinating multiple artillery batteries located miles apart to fire at different trajectories so that all their shells landed on the exact same target at the exact same second. Furthermore, the Americans were just beginning to deploy one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, the VT proximity fuse. Instead of relying on mechanical timers to detonate a shell in the air, the VT fuse used a miniature radio transmitter to detect when it was about 50 feet above the ground, detonating the shell and showering the enemy below with lethal, inescapable shrapnel. In the dense pine forests of the Ardennes, where tree bursts would turn the wood itself into flying shrapnel, this weapon would prove devastating. In terms of armor, the American workhorse was the M4 Sherman tank. By late 1944, the standard Sherman weighed roughly 30 tons and was powered by a reliable Ford GAA V8 engine, putting out 500 horsepower. The Sherman was a marvel of mass production, rolling out of Detroit arsenals by the thousands. It was mechanically reliable, easy to repair in the field, and featured a fast-traversing turret and a gyro stabilizer that allowed the gunner to keep his sights on target while moving. However, it was fundamentally outclassed in a head-to-head fight against heavy German armor. Its standard 75mm gun lacked the muzzle velocity to penetrate the thick frontal armor of the German Panther or Tiger tanks, and its own armor, roughly 2 inches thick on the front slope, could be easily punched through by German anti-guns from over a mile away. The American doctrine dictated that tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry, while dedicated, lightly armored tank destroyers like the M10 and M18 Hellcat were supposed to hunt enemy armor. This doctrine would fail spectacularly in the narrow confines of the Ardennes roads. Facing this thin, stretched American line was a massive German juggernaut, meticulously assembled under a blanket of total secrecy. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was the nominal commander in the West, giving the operation an aura of traditional Prussian legitimacy. But the actual execution fell to Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Führer's fireman for his ability to salvage desperate situations. The spearhead of the attack was the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS General Sepp Dietrich. Dietrich was a former butcher and a brutal enforcer from the early days of the Nazi Party, lacking the refined tactical education of the traditional general staff, but he commanded absolute loyalty from his fanatical Waffen-SS troops. His army was equipped with the heaviest armor Germany could produce. South of Dietrich was the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel. Manteuffel was a brilliant, aristocratic cavalry officer, a master of maneuver warfare and armored tactics. While Dietrich relied on brute force, Manteuffel planned to use infiltration tactics, slipping specialized infantry teams through the American lines in the dark, to bypass strong points and capture critical bridges before the Americans could blow them up. Protecting the southern flank was the German 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger, composed mostly of infantry divisions tasked with holding off the inevitable American counterattack from the south. The German arsenal was a study in extremes, combining terrifying technological superiority with desperate scraping-the-barrel pragmatism. The spearhead of the Panzer divisions was the Panzerkampfwagen V, the Panther tank. Weighing 45 tons, the Panther featured thick, sloped frontal armor and a lethal 75mm WK-42 gun with a massive barrel length that gave its armor-piercing shells incredible muzzle velocity. With its wide tracks, the Panther had a lower ground pressure than the lighter American Sherman, allowing it to maneuver better in the deep snow and mud of the Ardennes. But the true monster of the German arsenal was the Tiger I, or the King Tiger. This was a 70-ton behemoth, draped in nearly 6 inches of sloped steel armor on its front hull. Its 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman tank from 2 miles away, long before the American crew even knew they were being targeted. To an American infantryman, the King Tiger was practically invincible from the front. But why build a 70-ton tank when your bridges can only support 30 tons, and your fuel reserves are completely dry? This was the fatal contradiction of the German war machine. The King Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was a logistical nightmare. Its Maybach V12 engine was horribly underpowered for a vehicle of that weight, meaning the tank consumed nearly 2 gallons of synthetic gasoline for every single mile it drove. The transmission was incredibly fragile, prone to catastrophic failure if the driver attempted to pivot the tank too quickly on rough terrain. The German industrial base in the Ruhr Valley had been pulverized by American and British heavy bombers. Synthetic fuel production had plummeted. The German panzer armies assembled in the forests of the Eifel region had barely enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp. Hitler's entire operational plan relied on the assumption that German spearheads would overrun massive American fuel dumps and use captured American gasoline to drive their tanks to the sea. It was an offensive built on a foundation of desperate hope and strategic bankruptcy. To make up for their severe shortage of trained infantry veterans, the German army had created Volksgrenadier divisions. These were not the elite, highly trained stormtroopers of 1940 who had conquered France. These were units cobbled together from drafted sailors whose ships had been sunk, Luftwaffe ground crews whose planes had been destroyed, convalescing wounded, and young boogie boys. To compensate for their lack of training and tactical proficiency, the German High Command armed these divisions heavily with automatic weapons. They were issued massive quantities of the MG-42 machine gun, known as Hitler's buzzsaw for its terrifying rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute. Furthermore, many of these infantrymen carried the STG-44, the world's first true assault rifle. Firing a shortened intermediate cartridge, the STG-44 gave a single German infantryman the capability to lay down fully automatic suppressing fire at close range, a massive advantage in the dense, close-quarters environment of the Ardennes forests. The assembly of this massive force was one of the greatest feats of military deception in modern history. How do you hide 250,000 men, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, and 1,000 tanks from the greatest aerial armada ever assembled? The Germans utilized the weather and ruthless discipline. They moved only at night, under the cover of a massive low-pressure weather system that blanketed Western Europe in thick, freezing fog and heavy, overcast skies. This weather completely grounded the Allied tactical air forces. The American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons, which normally roamed the skies destroying anything that moved on the roads, were stuck on their airfields. The Germans enforced strict radio silence, relying entirely on landline telephones and motorcycle couriers to communicate. To hide the smoke from their campfires, troops were only allowed to burn charcoal. To mask the mechanical roar of the panzer divisions moving into their jump-off positions, the Germans spread thick layers of straw over the dirt roads and flew low-altitude aircraft back and forth over the American lines to drown out the noise of the tank engines. And then there was Operation Grafe, a psychological warfare operation commanded by the infamous SN8 commando Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny gathered English-speaking German soldiers, dressed them in captured American uniforms, and equipped them with captured American jeeps. Their mission was to slip behind the American lines before the main assault began, cut telephone wires, switch road signs at critical intersections, and spread panic and confusion in the American rear. While the physical damage they caused was minimal, the psychological impact would be immense, creating a paranoia that would paralyze movement for days as military police began interrogating every general and private alike on la baseball trivia and state capitals. As the second week of December dragged on, the temperature in the Ardennes plummeted well below freezing, hovering around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow began to fall heavily, blanketing the deep ravines and the dense pine branches in a blinding white powder. The men of the 106th and 28th Infantry Divisions huddled in their snow-filled foxholes, trying to keep their feet dry to avoid trench foot, completely unaware that directly across the line of sight, hidden just behind the tree line, Thousands of German artillery barrels were being quietly elevated and dialed in on their exact coordinates. The trap was set, the fuel tanks were topped off for one final, desperate charge, and the most devastating surprise attack of the Western Front was about to begin. At 0530 hours on the morning of December 16, 1944, the freezing silence of the Ardennes forest was shattered by a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces, ranging from standard 105mm field howitzers to massive 14-inch railway guns, erupted in a simultaneous, deafening roar across the 80-mile front. The barrage lasted for nearly 90 minutes, turning the dark, snow-covered forests into a chaotic inferno of flashing light, flying shrapnel, and shattered timber. For the American infantrymen pinned in their foxholes, the most terrifying sound of that morning was not the heavy artillery, but the shrieking wail of the German Nebelwerfer. This was a multiple-barrel rocket launcher that fired 150mm high-explosive rockets in a rapid 6-round ripple. Because the rockets were spin-stabilized by angled exhaust nozzles, they produced a horrifying, banshee-like scream in flight, earning them the nickname Screaming Mimes from the terrified GIs. While the Nebelwerfer was not a precision weapon, its psychological impact was devastating, and its massive high-explosive payload was highly effective at clearing vast areas of forest. The barrage pulverized American forward command posts, severed miles of landline communication wires, and left thousands of frontline troops completely isolated in the dark, freezing woods. As the artillery fire lifted and shifted to the rear, the ground began to tremble beneath the tracks of nearly 1,000 German tanks and assault guns pushing forward through the snow. But the German armored juggernaut immediately ran into the brutal reality of the Ardennes terrain. How do you maneuver a 70-ton King Tiger tank through a dense pine forest on a dirt logging trail built for horse-drawn carts? The answer is, you do not maneuver, you crawl in a rigid, vulnerable column. The Germans were forced to stay on the narrow, winding roads, lined by steep ravines on one side and sheer rock faces on the other. This created massive traffic jams, with vehicles bumper to bumper for miles. Furthermore, the brilliant engineering of the German heavy tanks suddenly became a fatal liability. The Panther and Tiger tanks utilized a complex suspension system called the Laufwerk, which featured overlapping and interleaved road wheels. This design was necessary to distribute the massive weight of the tanks, giving them a smooth ride and lower ground pressure. But in the muddy, freezing conditions of the Ardennes, this suspension was a death trap. During the day, the tanks churned through deep, freezing mud, which packed tightly between the overlapping wheels. When the temperature plummeted at night to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, that mud froze solid as concrete. By morning, hundreds of elite German tanks were completely immobilized, their tracks locked tight, requiring hours of chipping with pickaxes or the dangerous application of blow torches just to get the vehicles moving again. On the American side, the infantrymen were fighting a desperate battle against both the enemy and the elements. The standard-ish American leather combat boot was completely inadequate for standing in freezing, water-filled foxholes for days on end. The result was an epidemic of trench foot, a crippling condition where the blood vessels in the feet constrict, starving the tissue of oxygen until it literally rots and turns gangrenous. Thousands of American soldiers would become casualties without ever taking a bullet, their feet swelling to the point where their boots had to be cut off with knives. Even their primary weapon, the legendary M1 Garand, struggled in the extreme cold. The standard military lubricating oil used on the rifle's operating rod would congeal and freeze, causing the weapon to jam after a single shot. American GIs quickly learned to strip all the oil off their weapons, wiping them completely dry and using graphite from pencils to lubricate the moving parts, ensuring their rifles would cycle in the bitter cold. When the German infantry and armor finally hit the American lines, the battle shattered into dozens of isolated, desperate firefights. How do you hold a defensive line when the enemy outweighs you 10-1, your officers are dead, and your radios are completely silent? You rely on the backbone of the United States Army, the non-commissioned officer corps. Cut off from battalion and regimental command, American sergeants and corporals took charge of their squads and platoons, making tactical decisions on the fly, turning every crossroads, stone farmhouse, and narrow bridge into a bleeding choke point. Nowhere was this stubborn, localized defense more critical than on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, at a place called Elsenborn Ridge. Here, the green troops of the 99th Infantry Division, known as the Checkerboard Division, were hit by the full weight of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army. Dietrich's objective was to smash through the ridge, access the good road networks to the north, and race toward the Meuse River. He expected the inexperienced Americans to break and run. Instead, the 99th held their ground in the dense woods, fighting tree to tree. They were soon reinforced by the veteran 2nd Infantry Division, commanded by General Walter Robertson, who executed a brilliant and incredibly difficult fighting withdrawal, pulling his exposed regiments back through the lines of the 99th while under heavy attack. Once entrenched on the high ground of Elsenborn Ridge, the Americans unleashed the full, devastating power of their artillery. Using the newly deployed VT proximity fuses, American artillery battalions fired massive time-on-target barrages. The shells detonated 50 feet in the air, raining a lethal shotgun blast of jagged steel down into the dense pine forests. Entire battalions of German Volksgrenadiers were decimated before they could even deploy into combat formation. We can look at the Americans at Elsenborn Ridge and draw direct historical parallel to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, specifically the defense of Little Round Top. At Gettysburg, a small Union force held a critical piece of rocky high ground on the extreme left flank of the Union Army. If the Confederates had taken Little Round Top, they could have rolled up the entire Union line and potentially won the Civil War. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions held the extreme northern flank of the American line. By refusing to yield that high ground, they completely blocked the primary route of the 6th Panzer Army, forcing the heaviest German tanks into a massive traffic jam on inferior southern roads, effectively derailing Hitler's entire timetable on the very first day of the offensive. But while the northern shoulder held firm, the center of the American line was completely collapsing. In an area known as the Losheim Gap and the Schnee Eifel, the newly arrived 106th Infantry Division was facing some total annihilation. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army executed a textbook double envelopment, bypassing the heavily fortified American positions on the snowy ridges and slicing through the weakly held valleys on either side. Within 48 hours, 2 entire American infantry regiments, the 422nd and the 423rd, were completely surrounded. Their communication lines were severed, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and their divisional commander, General Alan Jones, was paralyzed by conflicting reports and an inability to grasp the speed of the German maneuver. Why did the 106th collapse so completely while other units held their ground? The answer lies in the fatal flaw of static defense combined with inexperienced leadership. The 106th was tied to its fixed bunkers and foxholes, lacking the motorized transport to conduct a mobile defense or a tactical retreat. When the German pincers closed behind them, panic set in. On December 19, 1944, out of food, out of water, and facing point-blank fire from German 88mm guns, the commanders of the 2 trapped regiments made the agonizing decision to surrender. Between 8,000 and 9,000 American soldiers marched into German captivity. It was the largest mass surrender of American troops in Europe, and the worst single defeat for the U.S. Army since the surrender of the Baton Peninsula to the Japanese in the Philippines in 1942. The destruction of the 106th ripped a massive 30-mile-wide hole in the center of the American line, leaving a clear path open to the west. Pouring through this gap was the most dangerous and ruthless unit in the German arsenal, Kampfgruppe Peiper. Commanded by the 29-year-old SS Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Peiper, this heavily armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division was tasked with leading the charge to the Meuse River. Peiper was a hardened, fanatical veteran of the Eastern Front, where the war was fought with zero quarter and absolute brutality. His battle group consisted of over 4,800 men and 600 vehicles, including a battalion of the terrifying King Tiger tanks. Peiper's orders were to advance relentlessly, ignore his flanks, and let nothing slow him down. On the afternoon of December 17, his spearhead reached a small crossroads hamlet called Bastogne, just 2 miles south of the town of Malmedy. At this crossroads, Pieper's advance guard intercepted a lightly armed American convoy from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Outgunned by German tanks, the Americans quickly surrendered. They were disarmed and herded into a snowy field adjacent to a local cafe. What happened next remains one of the darkest chapters in American military history. For reasons that are still debated by historians, whether by a deliberate order or a spontaneous act of bloodlust by hardened SS troopers, the German machine gunners mounted on half-tracks opened fire on the unarmed prisoners. 84 American soldiers were massacred in the snow, many shot in the head at point-blank range as German soldiers walked through the field finishing off the wounded. But the Malmedy massacre, intended to strike terror into the hearts of the Americans, achieved the exact opposite effect. A few survivors managed to play dead, wait for the German column to move on, and escape into the woods. They reached American lines, and within hours, the horrifying news was broadcast across the entire front via the SCR-300 backpack radios. The psychological impact on the American GI was instantaneous and profound. The rumor spread that the SS was taking no prisoners and slaughtering Americans who surrendered. This triggered a cold, furious resolve among the U.S. troops. Just as the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," galvanized the Texan army in 1836, the whisper of "Remember Malmedy" swept through the Ardennes. American infantrymen, previously terrified and confused, suddenly dug their boots into the snow and decided they would rather die fighting in their foxholes than surrender to the SS. German units attempting to negotiate surrenders over the coming days would be met with intense, concentrated rifle fire. Despite his ruthless momentum, Paper was fighting a losing battle against his own supply lines. What is the tactical value of a 70-ton tank if its fuel gauge reads empty? Paper's massive King Tigers were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. He was forced to deviate from his planned route specifically to capture American fuel dumps. At the town of Bullingen, Piper captured 50,000 gallons of American aviation fuel, forcing American prisoners to refuel his tanks at gunpoint. But his reliance on the narrow, winding roads of the Amblève River Valley proved to be his undoing. A small detachment of American combat engineers blew a vital bridge over the river, right in front of his lead tanks. Trapped in a deep, narrow valley with no way forward and American reinforcements closing in on his rear, Kampfgruppe Pieper was eventually surrounded and systematically destroyed by American artillery and fighter bombers once the weather finally cleared. Paper himself had to abandon his magnificent tanks, leading a few hundred surviving men on foot through the freezing woods back to German lines. While the northern shoulder held and Paper's spearhead was bogged down, the situation on the southern shoulder of the Bulge was rapidly deteriorating. Here, the German 5th Panzer Army was driving hard toward a vital strategic objective. To understand why this specific location was so critical, we have to look at the map of the Ardennes. The terrain is a maze of dense forests and deep gorges, making cross-country travel impossible for heavy trucks and tanks. Everything had to move on the roads. And in the southern Ardennes, 7 hard-surfaced roads converged on a single small Belgian market town. That town was Bastogne. If the Germans did not capture Bastogne, their entire southern offensive would choke to death on its own logistics. The heavy supply trucks carrying the fuel and ammunition for the Panzer divisions could not bypass the town on the muddy, unpaved farm tracks. General Manteuffel knew he had to take Bastogne quickly. Standing in his way was the battered, exhausted 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, commanded by General Norman Coda. Coda was a legendary combat leader who had rallied the troops on Omaha Beach, but here in the Ardennes he was asked to do the impossible. He had to spread his depleted regiments across a 30-mile front to stop 3 German armored divisions. The defense of the 110th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Division is one of the greatest and most tragic holding actions in military history. Stationed in small picturesque villages like Clairvaux and Hoesgen, the men of the 110th were ordered to hold at all costs. They turned stone farmhouses into fortresses and narrow village streets into kill zones. When German Panzer Mark IV tanks rolled into the town squares, American infantrymen fired bazookas from second-story windows, aiming for the thin top armor of the German tanks. They fought house to house, room to room, and cellar to cellar. The 110th Regiment was systematically surrounded, battered by artillery, and ground into dust. But they did not break and they did not retreat. They fought until they ran out of ammunition, and then they fought with fixed bayonets. By sacrificing themselves, the 110th Infantry Regiment bought the Allied High Command 48 hours of precious time. That time was the currency General Dwight D. Eisenhower needed to deploy his strategic reserve. Hundreds of miles away in France, resting in unheated barracks, after the brutal combat of Operation Market Garden, the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, were abruptly woken up in the middle of the night. They were told to grab their weapons and get onto flatbed trucks. They had no winter clothing, no white camouflage, and a severe shortage of ammunition. Many of the paratroopers literally stole crates of grenades and K-rations from adjacent supply dumps in the dark before their convoy rolled out. They drove through the freezing rain and snow, racing against the clock, heading straight into the teeth of the massive German offensives, completely unaware that they were about to be totally surrounded in a frozen town with 7 roads leading in and no roads leading out. When the men of the 101st Airborne Division piled out of their freezing trucks into the center of Bastogne on December 19, they were walking into a tactical meat grinder. They were completely surrounded by elements of 3 German divisions, including the elite Panzer Lehr and the 2nd Panzer Division. How does a lightly armed airborne division, lacking heavy tanks and massive artillery support, hold a perimeter against a mechanized juggernaut? The answer lies in the aggressive mobile defense orchestrated by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and the critical integration of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The paratroopers did not just sit in their foxholes waiting to be overrun, but instead formed combined arms teams with the M18 Hellcats of the 705th. The Hellcat was a masterclass in American armored doctrine, sacrificing heavy steel armor for blistering speed, capable of hitting 55 miles per hour on open roads. Armed with a high-velocity 76mm gun, the Hellcat crews utilized shoot-and-pass tactics in the snowy woods surrounding Bastogne. They would wait in ambush behind a snowy ridge, put a single armor-piercing round through the thin side armor of a German Panzer Mark IV, and then reverse out of position before the German turret could even traverse to return fire. This lethal game of cat and mouse bled the German armored spearheads dry and prevented them from massing for a single overwhelming breakthrough. The defense of Bastogne shares a striking strategic similarity to the siege of Khe Sanh during the Vietnam War in 1968. In both battles, a heavily outnumbered American force was completely cut off and surrounded by a massive enemy offensive in brutal, unforgiving terrain. In both cases, the American High Command made the deliberate decision not to order a breakout, but to use the surrounded garrison as an anvil. By holding that critical piece of real estate, the surrounded Americans forced the enemy to commit massive amounts of troops and resources to a protracted siege, bleeding the enemy's momentum and fixing them in place so they could be destroyed by overwhelming American air power and artillery. At Khe Sanh, it was the massive B-52 arc light strikes that shattered the North Vietnamese army. At Bastogne, the survival of the 101st Airborne depended entirely on the weather clearing so the Army Air Forces could drop supplies and unleash their fighter bombers. But before the skies cleared, the situation inside the Bastogne perimeter reached a point of absolute desperation. The American Medical Company had been captured outside the town on the very first day, leaving the garrison with almost no surgeons, no operating tables, and a critical shortage of penicillin and morphine. Wounded paratroopers were laid out on the freezing concrete floors of a local church, treated by a single American doctor and 2 heroic Belgian nurses, René Lemaire and Augusta Chiwi, who sterilized their few remaining surgical instruments in local Cognac. Ammunition was so low that artillery batteries were restricted to firing only 10 rounds per day. It was in this freezing, starving crucible that the German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, sent a formal written demand for the honorable surrender of the American forces to save Bastogne from total annihilation. General McAuliffe, exhausted and irritated, famously replied with a single, incredibly American word, nuts. When the confused German officers asked for a translation, an American colonel explained that it meant they could go to hell. This defiant rejection solidified the psychological resolve of the American defenders, proving that firepower and armor mean nothing if you cannot break the fighting ill spirit of the infantryman holding the line. On December 23, the brutal low-pressure weather system that had shielded the German army finally broke. A massive high-pressure system from Russia moved over the Ardennes, bringing freezing, sub-zero temperatures, but more importantly, crystal-clear blue skies. The roar of thousands of aircraft engines echoed across the frozen forests. Hundreds of C-47 Skytrain transport planes flew low over the Bastogne perimeter, dropping thousands of brightly colored parachutes loaded with K-rations, medical supplies, and 75mm artillery shells. But the real nightmare for the German Panzer divisions was the arrival of the American P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was a massive, heavily armored fighter bomber affectionately known as the Jug, armed with 850 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying 2 500-pound bombs or deadly high-velocity rockets. Without the cover of the clouds, the massive German traffic jams on the narrow Ardennes roads became a shooting gallery. American pilots flew relentless strafing runs, turning miles of German supply trucks, horse-drawn artillery, and fuel tankers into burning wreckage. The German logistical spine, already suffering from a severe lack of synthetic fuel, was completely severed from the air. While the skies rained fire on the Germans, one of the greatest logistical and tactical maneuvers in military history was unfolding to the south. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, was heavily engaged in the Saar region, pushing eastward toward the German border. On December 19th, at a crisis meeting with General Eisenhower in Verdun, Patton promised he could disengage 3 entire divisions from heavy combat, pivot them 90 degrees to the north, and launch a massive counterattack into the southern flank of the German Bulge in just 48 hours. The other Allied generals thought he was bluffing. How do you move an army of 250,000 men, over 60,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of artillery shells over icy, snow-covered roads in the middle of a blizzard without creating a catastrophic traffic jam? The answer was the brilliant, unsung staff work of Patton's logistical officers. They had secretly pre-planned the movement routes before the meeting even happened. Truck drivers drove for 48 hours straight without sleep, navigating treacherous, icy mountain roads in total blackout conditions. Military police stood at freezing intersections, prioritizing the movement of armor and ammunition. This maneuver is directly comparable to General George Washington's brilliant and rapid redeployment of the Continental Army in 1781. Washington secretly disengaged his army from the defenses of New York, marched them 400 miles south over terrible colonial roads, and trapped the British Army at Yorktown to win the American Revolution. Both Washington and Patton understood that speed, aggressive maneuver, and flawless logistical execution are the ultimate weapons of war. On the day after Christmas, December 26th, the spearhead of Patton's 4th Armored Division, led by an M4 Sherman tank named Cobra King, smashed through the German encirclement and linked up with the 101st Airborne, officially breaking the siege of Bastogne. To fully grasp the magnitude of the Battle of the Bulge, we must step back from the foxholes and analyze the massive intelligence failure that allowed it to happen. How did the greatest military intelligence apparatus in the world completely miss the assembly of 250,000 men? The Allies had become hopelessly addicted to ULTRA, the top-secret decryption of the German Enigma machine. Because they were reading German radio traffic, Allied commanders assumed that if ULTRA did not report it, it was not happening. But Hitler had ordered strict radio silence for the buildup, relying entirely on the dense buried network of landline telephones inside Germany. The Allies fell victim to confirmation bias, looking only for intelligence that confirmed their belief that Germany was defeated. This mirrors the tragic intelligence failure of Pearl Harbor in 1941. At Pearl Harbor, American commanders had the radar intercepts and the broken Japanese diplomatic codes, but their preconceived notion that Japan would never dare attack Hawaii blinded them to the reality of the incoming threat. In the Ardennes, the Allies ignored the reports of massive train movements and the desperate warnings of frontline reconnaissance patrols because it did not fit their narrative of a defeated enemy. From an economic and industrial perspective, Hitler's gamble in the Ardennes was an act of national suicide. Germany was fighting a two-front war against the greatest industrial superpowers on Earth. When an American Sherman tank was destroyed at the Bulge, the massive factories in Detroit and Flint, Michigan, had already built 3 more to replace it, and the Liberty ships were already carrying them across the Atlantic. When a German King Tiger tank broke its transmission or ran out of fuel and had to be abandoned by its crew, it was gone forever. The German industrial base in the Ruhr Valley was being systematically leveled by the strategic bombing campaigns of the U.S. 8th Air Force and the British Bomber Command. By committing his last strategic reserves of armor, fuel, and veteran infantry to the west, Hitler completely stripped the Eastern Front of its defenses. This political and strategic delusion had catastrophic consequences for the Third Reich. Hitler believed the capitalist Americans and the imperialist British would turn on each other if they suffered a severe military defeat. Instead, the crisis of the Bulge forced Eisenhower to temporarily hand command of the Northern American armies to the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. While Montgomery's arrogant personality deeply offended American generals like Omar Bradley and George Patton, the Allied command structure held firm. More importantly, by burning his last Panzer armies in the snows of Belgium, Hitler left the door wide open in the east. On January 12, 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched the massive Vistula-Oder offensive. Facing a hollowed-out German defense, Soviet tank armies advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, stopping only when they reached the Oder River, just 40 miles from the gates of Berlin. The Battle of the Bulge did not delay the end of the war, it directly accelerated the total collapse of Nazi Germany. By the end of January 1945, the American army had pushed the Germans back to their original starting lines, erasing the massive bulge in the map. But the cost was staggering. The United States suffered over 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead, making it the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. The German army suffered over 100,000 casualties and lost nearly all of their armored vehicles and aircraft committed to the offensive. The Wehrmacht was broken, incapable of ever launching another major offensive. The American GI, fighting in frozen, waterlogged boots, armed with a rifle that had to be wiped dry of oil just to fire, had absorbed the heaviest blow the German war machine could deliver, and had broken its back in return. The Ardennes forest remains a silent frozen monument to the brutal reality that technology and surprise can only carry an army so far, but ultimate victory is decided by the endurance and the unbreakable will of the soldier holding the line. Which factor do you believe was the most critical in the ultimate defeat of the German offensive in the Battle of the Bulge? A. The stubborn, isolated defense by American infantry at places like Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge. B. The clearing of the weather and the devastating impact of Allied air superiority. C. The catastrophic logistical failures and fuel shortages of the German war machine. Let us know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below.